Hello everyone, welcome back to some Call of Duty DFS action breakdown. So it's been a while for Call of Duty. Obviously I don't think I've made a video on any of the Call of Duty slates from this current Modern Warfare 2 game, but League of Legends has slowed down. I haven't been as active in CS:GO. So I figured, we'll try to get back into it. I did end up playing every slate last week. I didn't make any content on it just because I don't want to put out videos where I'm kind of just don't know what I'm talking about. But now I'm kind of getting back into the swing of things. I actually feel like by that last day, I actually had a pretty decent idea of kind of what's going on and stuff. So hopefully we can kind of pick back up where we left off. I know last in Cold War for last year's Call of Duty, we ended up actually having like a pretty solid time. I remember there was some of my bigger wins last year were on Call of Duty, which was a little bit surprising considering it's not really my main game. League of Legends, I would say, is definitely like the number one option. I don't even play Call of Duty anymore. Obviously, it's a simple enough game to where you don't really have to play it to kind of know what's going on, but nonetheless, I'm pretty excited. I think we've actually had a pretty good spot here, with everything. So hopefully we can return. I know this is like 1 week and then the major's back, but got to start somewhere. So we'll go ahead and get started. Looking at the odds right away, we can see a pretty clear kind of hierarchy, I guess. London versus Florida. I think this is definitely a pretty interesting one. It's definitely, I think, a battle of the bottom two teams in the league. I think the odds are relatively correct on here. I do think London is slightly better than Florida. I think for most, just watching the games as well as looking around, seeing everyone's power rankings, odds, everything, all that, just everything combined, it definitely feels like Florida is kind of the consensus worst team in the league. It seems like it was a close one between Florida and London, but London, I think, actually showed a little bit last week, so I think that does edge them a little bit above Florida. Also, Florida did end up having that roster swap. They ended up bringing back Dave Patty and they dropped Brack, which is a pretty interesting move. I think it was kind of considered that Brack was kind of one of their better players. At least he was stats wise and everything. So that's something to keep in mind as well. That's something we can look at here as well. I kind of want to pull up their stats. That way we can kind of just check. I know sometimes stats don't tell the whole story, but it is definitely a surprising one when we look at Florida. Yeah, Brack statistically was their best player, so most held time, highest KD, all that stuff. So it seems pretty lifeless and stuff for Florida, but things get interesting. Obviously, London, they made a roster swap as well, but they actually have a week played with it. They got rid of Zero. They brought in Paul, I believe. I believe that was the swap that they ended up making. They actually looked like relatively decent last week. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up the like scoreboards and stuff over on my other monitor where you can talk about it here. Let's see, London. They got 3-0'd here versus LA Thieves, but of course LA Thieves were pretty solid team. This hardpoint was actually pretty close. I think they were actually ahead in this one, like 100-30 or something. Like they actually should have won this hardpoint. And then in this Vegas Legion game, it ended up going their way. So I think that's definitely playing into the odds as well. We saw some pretty solid performances from a lot of these London guys last week. So I think for that reason, things could definitely get interesting in that aspect. So that's kind of the story there for that series. Obviously, we'll talk about it a little bit more when it comes to the players and stuff, but that's just kind of the base. Both teams roster swaps, bottom of the league, that kind of stuff. So looking over to the next series, we have New York versus Vegas. New York is a huge favorite, minus 410. I think that's kind of a crazy price. I definitely agree that New York should be a pretty sizable favorite. Obviously, they've been playing pretty well. They're probably like the they're definitely like one of the, I would say, like kind of 3 elite-ish teams. It feels like for the most part people consider Atlanta, New York, and Toronto, I think, to be like the top teams. Although Optics performances have been pretty strong. Obviously they're 3-0. It does feel like the league is pretty open. Kind of all things considered, we don't quite have we don't have the insanely dominant phase team that we do have that we have had from the years past. Things get a little bit more interesting, but New York obviously lost to FaZe in 5 last week. They 3-1 Florida and they 3-1 LA Thieves as well. The Thieves are a pretty solid team, so there's nobody, I think, really kind of a cut above anyone. I do think the whole league is relatively close, but Vegas have looked really, really bad. It's very hard to make a case here for that one, but we'll save that for when we go kind of team by team. And the last one up is Atlanta FaZe minus 240 versus LAG. That one seemed a little bit intriguing as well. I could kind of see a case either way, although those odds do feel a bit wide for me, but we'll kind of save our hesitations when we're talking about that one when we get there. So off the bat, pretty interesting slate. It's just 3-gamer. We have one that's kind of odds coin flippy, one that's relatively one-sided, and one I think is that the odds say it's a little bit one-sided, but I'm not too sure about that. So we'll go ahead and get started. So obviously we touched on a good bit for the first game, Florida versus London. London obviously got 2 games in last week with the new roster. They lost 3-0 to the Thieves. Again, not a huge deal. Thieves are a pretty solid team. And then Vegas Legion, they got the 3-1, obviously losing the Search and Destroy, which is something we're going to talk about with Vegas here in a little bit. I don't know. It's hard for me to look anywhere other than London here. I liked London a good bit last week. Obviously, it worked out for them one of the 2 times. I don't know what it is about this team. They're kind of just one that I have an affinity for. I don't know why I give them a little bit more credit than maybe others do usually, especially when we look at some of the players that they've had in the past. Obviously, some players like Afro who were there are not anymore. But they looked pretty solid last week, and it's pretty hard to ignore. So I do think the odds are going to continue to stretch here. I do think London is going to become a little bit bigger of a favorite. I do think when people kind of factor in that maybe Florida lost they substituted out their best player. They bring in Dave Patty, who statistically wasn't that strong either last year. It becomes pretty hard to make a case, I think, for Florida, even if you do consider these teams the worst 2 teams in the league. I feel like these odds are going to continue to expand. I feel like getting in on London at minus 125 here could make a good bit of sense. I do think looking at maybe betting London at like a minus 1.5 or something would make sense as well, although it looks like that's not being offered on Bovada, so that's interesting. But I do think these odds are going to stretch, and again, I think it's hard to find a case to go with Florida. We'll look at the team stats here. As we do look at the matchup here, Florida and London, of course. I'm going to set this just to stage 2. Obviously, stage 1 was feels like quite a bit a while ago, so that's kind of tough to ignore. Obviously, Florida, their respawns are tragic. That's kind of going to be the theme, I think, a little bit here today. As we do look at this, we see Florida 0-6 in hardpoint, 1-2 in control, London 3-3 in hardpoint, and then 1-3 in control as well. So obviously the discrepancy here, I think, is in hardpoint. Obviously 3-3 is not too inspiring, but when you look at the teams London played, it's not too bad. Again, they had that close match with the LA Thieves, obviously losing to Toronto, Minnesota. Like their losses are to pretty solid teams. So again, I just find it hard to make a case. Like there's really not much of a positive actual case to be made, I think, for Florida here. The case is, which, granted is a pretty solid idea, is just kind of like ownership, or you want to get to the other side of things. The weird thing here with pricing is that everyone in this series is super, super cheap. So I think people are going to be relatively like highly exposed to this one. I think you could definitely make a case for getting a 2-stack from this series, and it's pretty cheap. The pricing in this game has been and for this game has been weird. We see it be super top heavy. Like we see our cities at 1100, Hydra at 10.8. Like the top end players are super, super expensive. So when we have like super cheap players here in this series, you can make a pretty interesting case for sure. I think obviously when we look at somebody like Scraps at 6.2, he played very solid last week as well. Paul at 7.2, I probably would avoid Nasty at 7.8. He probably would be the one that I would leave off from this series, just because I feel like he's kind of been their worst player, and he's the second most expensive one. So I think you could leave him there in your player pool if you wanted, but he's going to be the one that I would probably try to avoid at first off. But Asim would be the one I would put in first. But again, that's just kind of the way I'm viewing this one. I find it very hard to get to Florida. I feel like I'm already rambling and going in circles, so I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I like going with London. I like London a good bit here. Again, they're super cheap. I'm going to get to them a good bit. They're going to be in probably all of my lineups, at least one, maybe two man. The main player I like to look at here has been Asim. Just because his engagement rate is usually very, very high. We could see engagement per 10 minutes, 45. It's definitely among the highest in the league. His numbers have not been that great. But I think when you get a solid player like him, who, I don't know, he was doing a lot better earlier in the year. I think if we look at stage 1, his numbers were much, much better. He was very, very solid in stage 1. We swap it over to stage 2. He's been kind of statistically their worst player. But again, when you have that engagement rate that's pretty high, that's something I'll value a little bit more, and what I perceive as like a relatively easy matchup. Especially if we look at just the last week where they had Paul X. We could see Scraps at a 1.4 in hardpoint. Again, it's only a 3-map sample, so I can't give it a huge amount of credit. But in this week that they played with Paul X, we could see Scraps did very well. Nasty had some upside, but Scraps mainly last week with Paul, he seemed to be playing pretty well. But again, I think you could definitely make a case to kind of leave anyone in your player pool, but for my thinking, I'm still fine going with somebody like Asim. I know this past week with Paul, he looked pretty poor, and especially during stage 2, he just has not been playing well lately. But when we look at this game and when we look at the series, I think it's a pretty easy one for London in the respawns. I feel like this is one we're going to look back on and think that the odds are going to be like relatively one-sided. So for that reason, I like to go with Asim. He's going to have these high engagements. We know he has that high upside as well. We know even all the way back from last year, he has these crazy nuclear pop-off games, and that's just something I want a decent amount of exposure to. So Asim would be my number 1, Scraps would be my number 2, and then Paul X would be my number 3, although you can definitely make a case to kind of reorganize that kind of how you want. I'm not going to argue with you that much. That's just how I view this one, for sure. New York versus Vegas. This one is very one-sided, and I don't necessarily disagree with it. So I think I'm just going to have to eat this New York chalk here. This is something we saw last year. We picked on the Clayster teams in Respawn, and we're going to continue to do that again. Obviously, these ones are very, very pronounced. Vegas is 1-8 in their respawns, and they're obviously 4-0 in Search and Destroy. If we look over at New York, they're 7-2 in Respawn and 1-3 in Search. It's just so insanely pronounced, one-sided towards the New York side in these Respawn game modes. It's just very hard to go any other direction, and that's the way I'm going to continue to go with it. I'm not going to make this one too interesting. I'm not going to make it more anything more than it needs to be. I like going with New York. I think this is going to be a very, very easy spot to go to. They do like to go to Fortress, which is a pretty solid map. Obviously, it's not quite as one-sided as how we looked at like Bocage in Cold War last year. I don't think there's any too big of a discrepancy when we look at the maps this year, but obviously I've been told at least that Fortress and Embassy are the kind of the two better options. Obviously New York bans Embassy, but they like to go to Fortress, so I think that's one where we could look at something at this series going. So yeah, I like going this direction. I like getting New York in a good bit as well. I assume all these players are going to be like pretty heavily owned on the New York side. I'm not going to disagree with it. Obviously, players, we'll look at players as a whole in a little bit later, but obviously it would be Hydra number 1, and then it's kind of just pick whoever you want. I would say I would have them tiered. I would definitely be Hydra 1, then you'd probably do Priesta and Kismet in like a middle tier. It's one of those two, and then Skies. My only problem with Skies is that his engagement rate is just so low. He's always the one that's kind of back on the hill, just kind of the one who's just kind of content to sit there while his team goes out and kills people. And that's just not something I want in a relatively one-sided matchup. So I would prefer to focus on Hydra, Kismet, and Priesta. I think people maybe are going to go heavily towards Priesta because he did have a really good performance last game, 130 points, very, very solid performance. So for that reason, I might go to Kismet over Hydra. But again, the price discrepancy here is pretty crazy, $2,000. So if I need the money, I'll go to Priesta. But I think ownership-wise, going up to Kismet would make a little bit more sense, and I think Skies would unfortunately be kind of the one that I would leave off in this instance. Last but not least, LAG versus Atlanta FaZe. This one is super, super interesting. So obviously LAG, they made the roster swap last week as well. If we look, they had Neptune, Spart, and I think they dropped those two for, I want to say, Exceed and Joe Deceives. I'm trying to remember. Maybe it was a 3-man swap. They got rid of Hook, Spart, Am, Neptune, and they got Joe Deceives, Exceed, and Assault. That's what it was. I can see by the maps played, of course, for this stage. And obviously, when we look at the stage 2 numbers here, the big thing that stands out is their 6-0 hardpoint record. That obviously matters a ton. That makes these things pretty interesting. Obviously, in DFS, we're looking for the players who win and do well in respawn game modes. The hardpoint and the control, of course, is what matters the most for these players. They're 6-0 in hardpoint. They're 0-3 in control. Atlanta FaZe are 1-3 hardpoint, 2-1 in control. I would obviously have Atlanta FaZe favored in these controls. I don't know. This one's very tough. This one is interesting, I think, especially from a DFS standpoint, because the odds, I think, could be a little bit misleading if you just look at the money line. Like if we look at the hardpoint ones, we can see it's FaZe minus 120. That's obviously a very big difference when it comes to how we kind of calculate this when we look at the players. If the two hardpoints, which obviously make up 2/3 of the respawns, are 50-50s, then that obviously leaves it very intriguing if we look over on the LAG side as opposed to the FaZe side. Obviously I would have FaZe favored in the series. I do think, kind of looking at the series odds, I do think it's relatively fair, but we're looking at players, we're looking at DFS scoring, we're not looking at money lines per se. So I think this is going to be a series I'm going to have a little bit less exposure to. I think if there was a series that I would be looking to get more one-offs, I think that would be the way I view this one. I would like to probably get like 2 London players, 2 New York players, as opposed to like 2 players from this third series. Obviously we have 5 flex spots, 5 player spots. We're going to need to do like a 2-2-1. I think it's probably the optimal way, although there's definitely a case to be made. Maybe you could go with like a 3-2. I think 2-2-1 is probably the optimal build. And this is probably going to be the series where I have the one of the most often in. When we look at players to one off, obviously Celium would be the one. However, again, when we look at the stage 2 stats, he has just not been there, especially in the hard points. Abizi is the only positive kill death ratio player in the hard points. It is a 4 map sample size, so it's not, nothing. So I don't know. It's pretty interesting. Abizi's numbers, especially in this area, are pretty decent, but I don't know. It's tough. The caveat I'll say with Atlanta FaZe is New York is obviously a very, very solid team. Minnesota, I think, is not on the New York level maybe, but they're still pretty solid. So I think their defeats could be a little bit written off as playing against solid teams. But again, it's not like they're getting a cakewalk matchup here either in LAG, who is 6-0 in hardpoint. I think that maybe this 6-0 could be a little bit misleading. But again, I don't think people are going to dig too far deep into this. So I don't know. This one's a little interesting because of that hardpoint record that LAG have. So there's just too much here for me that's kind of pulling me every different direction, and that's why I like to kind of go this one a little bit lighter on. I do like both sides. I think there's definitely pieces you can gather from both sides, especially when we look at I think somebody like Joe Deceives, 1.13 overall kill death ratio, hill time is at 90. That's very, very good. That's a lot of DraftKings points for sure. Super high engagement. That means he's doing exactly what we want our DFS players to do. He's getting that hill time. He's winning engagements on the hill. He's racking up points in every way that you can. And that's something I like to look at and value highly. But again, his price is out pretty high. This whole series is very expensive. So 9.2, you could definitely make a good case to get to him. I definitely enjoy getting there. Again, when we look at the face side, I don't know, it's a little bit tough. But yeah, we'll go to the player stats. That way we can have an idea of kind of look at how everything breaks out together as the whole slate. I'm going to set it to just a stage 2. I like the very recent numbers when we look at Call of Duty. I like to see how people are going in the exact moment. That's just something that I value. So when we look at overall kill death ratio, Hydra a good bit above everyone. He's pretty consistent. Priesta there as well. Abizi, Temp, Kismet, RCD Scraps, Brack. He's not in the player pool. He's not playing. Obviously, we see some pretty low-end players here as well. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of them right away. I think I'm probably going to get rid of Clayster and Tej as well. This is probably the limit I would have on my player pool, but again, I'm going to continue trimming it. I'm not going to have any Vegas Legion. I think, again, their respawn record is just too much of a reach for me even. Florida, I definitely think you can make a case to go with Florida. Like I talked about before, they're very cheap. They might be a little bit under-owned, maybe where they should be. They're in a 50-50 matchup. I just don't like it. I just feel like when we look at this one in hindsight, after the games are going to be played, we're going to be thinking this was pretty one-sided. We probably should have gone heavier on the London side. So I'm going to go ahead and make my stand there. I'm going to go with London over Florida a good bit. So that leaves us with a relatively thin player pool, but I'm pretty fine with that. Let's look at hardpoint kills per 10 minutes. We like to have that action. So we see Hydra and Priest up there as well. Joe Deceives. Obviously, Joe has that highest super high hardpoint hill time. We can see Kismet there as well. So that is pretty solid for that player pool idea. Joe Deceives, Kismet. So that's 3 New York players there. You could definitely make maybe you want to fiddle around, go with that triple New York stack. Maybe they just win the respawn modes pretty hard. That's definitely, I think, in that realm of possibility. It's not like New York is super, super expensive. I don't think it's pretty unlikely, but maybe it's a decent way to get unique. I think most people are going to go with a similar mindset to mine of that 2-2-1. Maybe if you wanted to go with like a 3-2, I think that can maybe be a little bit unique, but nonetheless, I think that kind of thins down the player pool pretty quickly. But yeah, I mean, I'm pretty interested. I think for me, it's going to be a pretty straightforward slate. I'm going to go with London, New York. I think you could definitely make a case to go with either side in this final one, but um, I think I'm going pretty heavily here. I like, again, Hydra, Kismet, Priesta. Um, Maybe you could mess around, try a 3-stack, but I think probably just 2 of those 3 for sure. London, I think, is pretty similar. I think I like going a seam. I'd like his upside. I think this is a good matchup for him. But again, I think you could go with like kind of any 2 or even 3 London guys if you wanted to go that direction. I could definitely make a case to go like a seam, Paul Scraps, or something of the sort. I do wonder who has the hell time for stage 2 for them. So it is Paul, it is Scraps. It doesn't look like they have any one person in particular. So that's something that you can kind of keep in mind, when you look at that direction as well. So, yeah, I think that's kind of it. I don't want to take up too much of your guys' time. Again, when it comes to LAG Atlanta, I'm personally just going to be taking like a relatively low approach on this one. I think I'm going to probably have 1 player max from this series. I doubt I'm going to get too cute with it. They're just all too expensive to really justify. I think obviously the direction you wanted to go, if you wanted to get to save a little bit of money, would be, I think, a BZ at 8.4. His numbers lately have been pretty solid. That's the direction that I would go if you wanted to look at Atlanta FaZe. Obviously, we know his action is very high. His numbers are pretty high. He would be the direction if you wanted to go on FaZe side. I'm going to try to get to the Joe Deceives. I'm going to try to get that money there. I do think that maybe they can keep it close enough in these respawns. They're obviously 50-50 when it comes to the odds-wise for the hard points. So if they win 1, lose 1, maybe lose the control, I think Joe Deceives can do enough in like that scenario where maybe they lose like 1-3. I don't know. It's tough. Again, I just don't want to get too invested in either side of this series. The only caveat there is I think Exceed is very, very cheap. So if you ended up there and you go Joe Deceives and Exceed, that's not the worst idea. It's just hard to justify that kind of build, I guess. So I don't know. I don't think I'm going to be having very unpopular opinions here. I think this is definitely riding the chalk pretty heavily. I think I'm not too in tune with where people go typically when it comes to ownership and stuff, but obviously with the money line the way it is, New York is going to be very popular. I'm hoping people talk themselves into London or into Florida because I want to go London very heavily. And then again, I think LAG Atlanta will be relatively split. So, or maybe people are going to go to that FaZe side a little bit more than they should. So hopefully we can mix in the right pieces from London, New York, and LAG, and that'll be my recipe. So that'll be it for me tonight. Sorry for the kind of weird video, kind of getting back into everything. Voice is still kind of getting back to where it should be. I'm feeling a lot better, but still obviously don't quite have the full voice back. So hopefully you guys got some use out of this video. That will be it for me tonight. Sorry for the rambling and all across the board, still working my way back into getting used to doing all this stuff. So thank you guys for bearing with me if you made it this far, and I appreciate it. And I will see you guys after this first set of games. We can reconvene and resume for the rest of the weekend. So thank you guys, and I will see you guys then.